Hi, my name is Josh Taylor. I'm a research associate with the VCU Rehabilitation Research and Training Center. And I'm going to talk to you right now about some employment statistics that describe the state of employment for folks with disabilities. So over the course of my talk, I want to try to show kind of big picture of overall the state of affairs for the employment of people with disabilities. As part of that, I'll look at some of the overall statistics on the employment and underemployment of some of the folks with disabilities overall, and then look at what employment looks like for some specific groups that we want to talk about targeting. I also want to touch on a few problems with interpreting some of these statistics, and so some cautions about possibly overgeneralizing based on what we know kind of these numbers are actually referring to and how they're being measured. I want to talk a little bit about accommodations and some of the statistics that refer specifically to how accommodations work to provide opportunity for employees with disabilities and to make them successful in workplaces. And then we'll kind of wrap it up with some main takeaways at the end. So just to kind of paint a big picture overall of the employment of people with disabilities, the most important thing I think to start off and touch on is that people with disabilities, with a range of disabilities, can and do provide a tremendous amount of value to businesses and organizations in all industry sectors. That's across the board from healthcare and technology to education and other industries. So there are people with disabilities working and creating value in all of those organizations and spaces. However, what we do see kind of overall as a trend, in spite of that contribution and value that people with disabilities can bring to the businesses that they work for, is that unemployment rates are much higher for people with disabilities at all levels of education. And so that means when we look at comparing college graduates with disabilities to other college graduates, unemployment rates are much higher for people with disabilities in spite of their relative skill set and knowledge base. And we know a lot about, from research and from policy, about what works to provide employment for folks with disabilities. So we have models that for what is helpful to make individuals successful in different kinds of workplaces. But in spite of that, we see that jobs growth is still slow or static in a lot of places, despite policy to change that to make more positive growth and incentivize some of that growth in different sectors. But we do also see some industry leaders and some business really becoming champions of employing people with disabilities and really investing in how they can make their organizations models of better workforce inclusion and accessibility, and really driving some of the increases to their business and the return on investment through really investing in people with disabilities as a core part of their workforce and talent base. So let's get right into the statistics. So overall, when we count the employment of folks with disabilities, we have to determine a few things of what we're really talking about, so we're not comparing apples to oranges. And so when we look at these kind of broader trends of how many people with disabilities are employed, we have to determine things like, what does it mean to have a disability and how does that qualify? How do we define the working age population, and so that range that we're using as our total sample to draw those comparisons from? And then how do we count the employment rate? So as a result, as you see in the table here, when we calculate those in three different ways, we come to three different answers. So three of the main national surveys come from the Census Bureau, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and something called the Survey of Income and Program Participation, the SIP. And so each of these calculate those rates in a little bit different ways and come up with different answers. But what we see is that the prevalence of individuals with disabilities in that working age group, so typically between about 21 and 64, retirement age, is between 7.8% and 16%. So a pretty wide range, but we have a general sense of that it's about 1/6 to 1/12 of the total population. And within that, the employment rate varies a little bit too, but it's generally between 30 and 40%. So you can see that's well below what the employment rate overall for the entire population is. So we see quite a bit of lag that creates a great opportunity for businesses to take advantage of some of this talent that's out there. When we look at kind of overall disability prevalence, and this is from one of the reports, so remember that how this is calculated can be a little bit different from report to report. It's from the Disability Status Report in 2017. we see that about 10% of the population, so kind of in the middle of that range, is identified as having a disability. And that breaks down between a lot of different categories that include visual impairments, hearing impairments, ambulatory, which is a physical impairment that affects movement, cognitive impairments that can include intellectual disability or other learning disabilities, autism. Self-care is the ability to kind of take care of oneself, and independent living refers to a broad range of what we call adaptive skills that affect an individual's ability to kind of navigate the community and kind of live on their own. And so, again, we'll talk about accommodations in a little bit, but for each of these, one of the things that's very important to know is that we have strong research that indicates different supports and accommodations that can be used with individuals within each of these groups to make sure that they're successful in a workplace environment. And so one of the groups that I want to target specifically, we've talked a little bit about kind of broader trends, the employment of people with disabilities, but the employment of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So these are disabilities that include intellectual disability itself, obviously, but also things like autism spectrum disorder. So this group has some of the lowest outcomes of any group of people with disabilities, even compared to people with other disabilities. The overall rate of employment is much, much lower. And so the graph that you're seeing here shows a trend over the last about 3 decades of the employment of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in different types of work and non-work. And so that black band at the bottom is integrated employment. So that refers to typical work. And so that's working in a competitive job, earning living wages, at least minimum wage, in a job that's integrated in the community along with people with disabilities. And so that's actually the target of recent legislation, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, that really targets that as the ideal outcome for all individuals with disabilities, including this group of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Facility-based work is kind of an older model that is being phased out. And so this is where people with disabilities have been segregated from peers without disabilities, and are typically not working for a business in a competitive way, in a competitive manner, and lots of times the individuals engaged in this facility-based work are making sub-minimum wage. And so this recent legislation has actually phased out facility-based work as an option. But we also see that a lot are in non-work situations. And so that group is actually increasing over time rather than decreasing. However, I point this out not to paint a picture of doom and gloom, but to point rather to potential opportunity, as this comes at a time where, in spite of the increase in the number of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities who are unemployed or underemployed, that are being phased out of these kind of older models of non-work and facility-based work, we also know more than ever about the supports that are needed for folks within this group to be successful. So in a recent study, Wayman and colleagues in 2019 used a business integrated internship model called Project Search plus ASD supports. And this study was specifically with a group of students with autism that were exiting from high school and entering adulthood in the workforce. And so as we saw in some of those graphs before, the employment rate of people with autism in competitive integrated employment, so in these business settings, is in the teens or around 10%. But what we saw from the study is that 73.4%, when we provided the right supports to these participants, were able to gain successful competitive employment in a business. And so by providing really integrated job support services and training through staff that were trained to give specific supports to these groups, they were successful and were able to contribute value to a company and in an open role. And so overall, we see the employment rate, so the change in the employment of people with disabilities, in spite of this kind of overall lag behind the overall trends for people without disabilities, those rates kind of fluctuate around the same level. And so this is data from the National Trends in Disability Employment Report. So they put out a report every month that gives a quick update compared to this month last year of what those overall rates are. And again, the percentage changes fluctuate between 0.5 and about 2%. And so we can see from January 2019 to January 20, there was an increase of almost 2% in the employment of people with disabilities, but those numbers overall are still very, very low. When we look at sort of labor force participation from 33% to 33.6%, compared to about 78% overall for people without disabilities. And so while that's increasing and related to factors like having better research and better services that can make individuals with disabilities more successful and provide that accessibility in workplaces, that we're still seeing a lag behind kind of what the overall productivity numbers should be. So again, points out a great opportunity to provide a great talent pipeline to businesses looking to engage them. So I think it's important when we talk as well about statistics affecting the employment of people with disabilities, to talk specifically about accommodations. So what we know from some research about kind of perceptions of employing people with disabilities is that one of the concerns that some businesses have who have never employed or seen an individual with disability successful in their workplace is that there's a perception that that's going to be a costly investment, or that that's going to be something that's difficult and really drains the resources of the business. Whereas actually the reality is quite different than that. What we find from research in the area of accommodations for people with disabilities is that the majority of accommodations are completely free. 58% of a recent survey found that the accommodations for the individuals in those workplaces to enable them to be successful and contribute to their teams were totally free. The cost of those other ones was typically under $500. And 74% of the employers who reported on the use of accommodations found that they were very or extremely effective at supporting that individual within the workplace, but then also led to other direct and indirect benefits for the entire business. And so those could be the integration of the person within the team, overall culture change, and even the benefit to other employees that the accommodations weren't designed for. And so, again, big takeaways: most accommodations are free, and they also have a benefit beyond just that one individual with a disability. So I want to kind of back up a little bit and talk about some caution, especially when we look at overall trends. We talked about this a little bit at the beginning with looking at those variations in how the rates of employment for people with disabilities are counted differently. And so again, different survey instruments measure both disability and employment differently. So that could be in terms of wages or hours, that could be in terms of how the disability label is conferred, whether they have to be referred from a specific agency. And so we have to use caution when interpreting these numbers. But what we do know is that the rates of employment for people with disabilities are much, much lower and present a real opportunity for growth for a lot of businesses. Again, the unemployment rate, when we look at just that, sometimes doesn't include those with disabilities who are underemployed or are discouraged workers. And so those are workers who have been unemployed for a period of time and are no longer perhaps seeking unemployment benefits, if that's the way that employment's calculated. And so they've sort of essentially left the workforce. And so we can't make sort of ironclad claims on some of these numbers. But what we do know is that many of the individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities are still engaged in this segregated sub-minimum wage vocational activity. And so again, that's something that recent legislation is phasing out. And so increasingly, individuals that leave school and enter the workforce, that will not be an option for them. And they will be going straight into seeking a competitive integrated employment. And the last thing we talked about is just how age is measured makes it a little bit different, determining of course, as individuals age and especially are over 64, they're less likely to work and more likely to be retired, but also more likely to have a disability later in life as well. So the way that those are calculated can be a little bit different. So in summary, people with disabilities are a largely underutilized talent pool that represents great growth in multiple industries. And we do have successful models within research and practice for showing how individuals with a range of disabilities can be successful and create value for organizations and businesses. And research also shows that we can provide successful employment for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So this is the group that has the lowest outcomes of any group. We still have models that show that success can be achieved with the right supports that are available through job coaching and employment service organizations. And then finally, the other important takeaway is that accommodations work. They're effective at making people with disabilities successful at work and providing that accessibility and those supports and accommodations, and most cost absolutely nothing. And so they have an additive benefit to the company beyond just the person with a disability that they're targeting specifically, and most cost absolutely nothing. So we have a few resources that are posted that you can check out further that get a little bit more into detail about some of these statistics that we've shared and provide a little bit more context with some more extensive reports that are linked here and also on the website that this webcast appears on. And thank you very much for taking the time to check this out. I encourage you to look at some of our other resources on our website, ep.vcurrtc.org. Thank you very much.